And that is what occurred right here. I do want to tell you a little bit about what led us, what got us to this point. And, you know, y'all know the Revolutionary War started, it was up in Boston. Heavy fighting in the North for 2.5 years, until after the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, it was an absolute stalemate in the North. There were no major battles up there after Monmouth. And the British shifted their attention to the southern campaigns because they felt like there was a lot of loyalist support here in the South, and they would have an easier time of it. So they took Savannah on December the 30th of 1778, and that was a very important toehold that the British had. Once Savannah fell, there was dark clouds forming over the South. 14 months after that, Charleston fell in May of 1780. That was the biggest defeat in the Revolutionary War for the Patriot forces when Charleston fell. And the Continental Army, the South Carolina Continental Army, was captured at Charleston, 2,500 men, and they were put on the prison ships down in Charleston Harbor. So George Washington sent down Horatio Gates with another army to counteract the British influence in South Carolina. This is under Horatio Gates. And they had a battle at Camden in August of 1780, and that was a terrible defeat for the Patriot forces. Camden was a disaster. You know, 50% casualties, killed, dead, wounded, and captured. And the only way the survivors of that battle got away is they literally ran through the swamps. Otherwise, they would have been rounded up as well. But so Gates was a disaster. And now George Washington's sending his third army down to counteract British influence in South Carolina. But this time, he's got the best general in the American Revolution, and that is Nathaniel Greene. And he sends Nathaniel Greene down with about 2,000 men, experienced Continentals. Now, the survivors of Camden, the 1st and 2nd Maryland regiments, for instance, and Kirkwood's Delawareans, these fellas are top-notch, the best that the Patriots had, even though they did lose so horribly at Camden.
It was leadership at Camden that cost them.
Well, you could certainly
Gates
say
should have
that.
been cashiered and should have been tried for treason and shot. I mean, he put his spurs to his horse and didn't stop until he got to Charlotte.
Gates certainly mismanaged that battle. There's no doubt about it. So Greene is coming down, and he gets into the Charlotte area. Cornwallis at this time is in Winnsboro. So what has happened while Greene was getting ready and coming on down is the Battle of Kings Mountain occurred. When Charleston fell, the British set up posts and forts in Georgetown, Camden, 96, Augusta. And these were strong. He had South Carolina in a stranglehold. And after Camden, he thought that South Carolina was totally defeated, so he went to Charlotte. That's when the activities began with Kings Mountain. And in October of 1780, when Kings Mountain fell, they lost that battle, Cornwallis had to retreat back to Winnsboro. So now Greene comes down to Charlotte. And Cornwallis has got about 2,000 men. Greene has got about 2,000 men, but Cornwallis's men were the best of the best. They were a force to be very wary of. And what Greene did was something that the book says you don't do. He divided his army in the face of a greater enemy. So he took half of his army and he went down to the Chirals on the North and South Carolina border. And he sent Daniel Morgan and half of his army to Grindle Shoals in Spartanburg County, which is down that way a little ways, on the Packlet River. And that's where Daniel Morgan set up his camp, and he got there on Christmas Day of 1780. So, what does Tarleton do? What does Cornwallis do? If he takes all his men and goes up and attacks Greene, then he leaves the back door open for Morgan. But if he takes everybody and goes after Morgan, now Greene comes down. So Greene put Cornwallis in the quandary. And so Cornwallis had to divide his forces. And he sent half of his men after Daniel Morgan. And that is what has led us to the Battle of Cowpens, which occurred right here in January 1781. Now, this time we're going to go over the spot because as it's relates to what's happened as the battle progressed, and I'm not going to talk about a lot of details about the battle per se right now because I'm going to do that after we start up where the battle started, up that way, and then we're going to gradually work its way back. But this is the Continental Line right here. This is where the main defense was for, the Patriot forces under Morgan. So, again, I'm going to give you the layout on, how things occurred as we come back to it. I would like to talk about the Washington Light Infantry Monument here. This is a civic organization that was formed down in Charleston. They actually banded together in 1807 when there were rumors that Spain and France was going to take over the United States. Because we had a fragile start, folks. And the fact that we were united made all the difference in the world. Otherwise, we'd be speaking English to this day. That was a joke. But anyway.
Two peoples united by a common language.
That's it. But, so that was the Washington Light Infantry, and they've been growing strong ever since. And I've had the pleasure of being able to work with those folks in certain regards. They are the keepers of William Washington's grave, for instance, down near Ramtoles, South Carolina, which is south of Charleston. William Washington was an absolute hero here. So we'll be talking about him throughout the battle. But again, this is where the Continental Line was. You see those magnolias over there? That is Morgan Hill. That's where Daniel Morgan observed the battle from. You can basically see most of the battlefield from that spot. So that's an important feature on this battle. And we've got a battlefield, and we've got a few others to show as well. This national park was created in 1976 when it was for their 200th anniversary. So when it was created, this gravel road that you see right now, which is the Green River Road, that was paved. There was a filling station right there and a post office. And if you look, you'll be able to see squares throughout the area where old homes used to be. These trees that you see, these are home place trees. So, but they do have a definite character to them, and it's somewhat typical of how the battlefield would have been. Some areas would have been more open, some areas would have been more wooded. But, the government took over these houses. I mean, there was like 50 houses here, and they bought those folks out, through eminent domain or whatever else means they saw they had to. So that's how this park got created. But it's a wonderful recreation. It really is. Of a 3-pound grasshopper cannon. They call grasshoppers because when this thing fires, it just jumps back 4 feet. And you kind of have to, wrestle it all over again. There would have been 10 men attending to this. Banastre Tarleton had 2 of them. And again, a 3-pound grasshopper. It shot a 3-pound ball, and these cannons fired. There were 2 together 8 times throughout the battle. They really had no effect at all on the battle. But as they fired, you know, the elevation of the balls would basically remain the same all the way through, and it would come through, bouncing through the battlefield. And you know, nobody wants to see a bouncing cannonball coming out. About the only effect it had at all is William Washington and his cavalry was way back in the back as a reserve, and when they saw cannonballs start bouncing towards them, they, you know, shifted position a little bit, but that was about it. But these cannons are effective in many ways, and the 3-pounder, you know, there were 6-pounders and 12-pounders and so forth, but they were much harder to handle and deal with and go through, you know, rutted out muddy roads and across rivers and all that sort of thing. You could manhandle this 3-pounder and get it to go where you needed it to go. And when you loaded that with grape shot, you know, little small lead balls, it's like it's most effective as a small shotgun. You know, that thing just blasts out, and nobody's going to be charging into that. So this is what a 3-pound grasshopper looked like. It was an effective weapon during the American Revolution. Artillery caused the end of the palisaded forts. Once the artillery got introduced, the rest of the forts after that were earthen or brick. But anyway, wanted to show you that, and now we'll continue on. So, the Battle of Cowpens started about 3 miles down the road that way. And it started about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning of January the 17th. It was a very cold day that day. It was misty. It was high humidity. High humidity in January. That doesn't, I'm no meteorologist. I don't know what that means. But anyway, got a hawk coming through. But at about 2 o'clock in the morning, Daniel Morgan sent out Sergeant Everhart on a scouting mission, and he had a total of 12 men with him. And they started traveling down this road right here, the Green River Road. And they were looking for Tarleton's army, and they ran into Tarleton's vanguard, and shots were fired, and Sergeant Everhart got very much wounded. He got shot in the elbow, he got shot through the leg, he got sabred about 6 times, both shoulders, everything. He was disabled for the rest of his life, and he later became a Methodist minister in Maryland. But he was sitting there wounded, and this green-clad officer came up to him and said, is Morgan in Washington, are they going to fight tomorrow? And Everhart said to him, if they can hold 200 militia together, then yes, they will. And so the green-clad officer said, well, then it's going to be another Camden, because I told you how bad it was at Camden just a few months previous. And then Sergeant Everhart said, no, it'll be another Tarleton defeat. And the green-clad officer said, I am Colonel Tarleton. And Everhart looked at him and says, I am Sergeant Everhart. And that was the end of that conversation. So the Battle of Cowpens started with Sergeant Everhart. And it ended with Sergeant Everhart. At the end, and I'm telling you this now out of sequence, but at the end, when the British camp was being overrun, and Everhart was held under guard in a prison wagon in that camp. And all of a sudden, here comes Washington's cavalry and the mounted militiamen charging through, trying to capture the things that are in the British camp. And one of those items was the British gold, which was captured but then recaptured. But anyway, at the end of the war, these militiamen and so forth, they were looking for booty, and there's no more booty than there is in a British camp. And so Sergeant Everhart was there under guard. By the way, I meant to tell you, after Tarleton and Everhart had that exchange, Tarleton said he sent Everhart to his physicians to bind his wounds. You know, Tarleton's got the reputation of being a, one to create massacres. And at the Battle of the Waxhaws, that was not necessarily a massacre. There were only a few people raised after the white flag, and major confusion about when the white flag was raised. And Tarleton was out of that battle the whole time anyway, because in the first volley, his horse was killed, fell on top of him, and Tarleton was pinned under his horse during the Battle of the Waxhaws, even though he gets all the blame for a massacre. But there is evidence that right here, he ordered the 71st Regiment of Foot, Captain Duncanson in particular, to give no quarter. When these British officers were surrendering at the end of this battle, they were fearful for their lives. That's why 7 of them gave their swords to Andrew Pickens, because they knew he was an honorable man and he wouldn't allow them to be killed after the white flag was raised. They were shaking in their boots. Why are you acting this way? We were told to give no quarter, and we expected as much. So, but contrary to that is, after Waxhaws, Tarleton is sending the wounded to the Waxhaws Presbyterian Church, which was turned into a hospital. He carried the wounded to the hospital, which was 10 or 12 miles away. Here he's ordering Sergeant Everhart to have his wounds bound. So Everhart, he was able to hear the battle go on, but he didn't know who was doing what. And then all of a sudden he sees the militia come racing through the British camp way back in the back. And his guard, armed with a pistol, takes that pistol and he points it right at Everhart's head. And at the last second, Sergeant Everhart bucked his arm as that shot rang, and it creased his head right across through there, and a profuse amount of blood. And just at that time, the Patriot forces came up, and it was Cornet James Simmons of the 1st Continental Light Dragoons. He was the one, he came up and he went to Sergeant Everhart, who he knew, and said, and saw this fresh wound. He says, "How'd you get that?" He said, "That fellow over there tried to shoot me." And so James Simmons gave the order then to have that man shot, which was immediately taken care of. So the Battle of Cowpens ended with Sergeant Everhart. And it began with him as well. Since we're here, I do want to talk about this picture right here in particular. And this is about my favorite picture, painting of the American Revolution. And what it shows is William Washington right here. I briefly mentioned him a few times. He was in charge of the cavalry. He was the lieutenant colonel of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons. The 3rd Continental Light Dragoons were the premier cavalry unit in the United States. Now, Light Horse Harry Lee, he had a damn good cavalry unit too. And Lee and Washington are 2 giants of American cavalry. But Washington was pure cavalry, and he had 80 light dragoons here. And this scene occurred at the very end of this battle, when Washington and his men, were surrounding the British forces. And Tarleton was observing the absolute, utter defeat. There were 3 British officers that were hanging back as the rest of the army was pell-mell down through the area down there. And William Washington saw those three officers mounted on their horses. Now, was one of those officers Banastre Tarleton? Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, he gathers his men. He says, "Hey guys, let's go get them." And so they start. He's got a squad coming up to attack those three officers, and so they start taking off. And they notice that William Washington is outpacing his support, and he's 30 yards ahead. So suddenly they turn and they wheel, and they start having one of the most dramatic sword fights in the American Revolution. And during that sword fight, William Washington's sword gets broken at the hilt. And Cornet Patterson back here is getting ready to chop off William Washington's head, when a waiter, too small to wield a sword, raises his pistol and wounds Cornet Patterson. Now, this picture was painted in 1845. It was painted based on an account from a letter that John Edgar Howard wrote in 1807. John Edgar Howard was the commander of the Continental Line, where we looked at it at Washington Light Infantry Monument. So John Edgar Howard wrote that letter in 1807. It was published in the Baltimore newspaper in 1811. It was just, the talk, and it was the rage. And William Ranney wanted to paint that picture. But he could not have got it more wrong when it came to the colors and the uniforms that these people were wearing. For one, no cavalryman would ever ride a white horse. It stands out too much.
That's all you see in the picture. That's what you're drawn to.
Yes, yeah. So you wouldn't have done that. William Washington wore white. His uniform was white with blue trim. And Banastre Tarleton over here, his uniform was green. Cornet Patterson did have a red uniform on. He was with the 17th Continent of 17th Cavalry that was here fighting. So, a lot of inaccuracies in this picture. One of the inaccuracies or the factors that we don't know about is young Colin here. We have three descriptions of Colin, and they all describe how small he is. A boy, 14 years old, with puny arms, too small to wield a sword. A waiter, no reference whatsoever to his race. So we don't know for sure if Colin was black or not. There's 2 or 3 other paintings, pictures of this scene, and they do not show Colin as being black. We do know that this fella here and this fella here fought 18 days earlier at Hammond's Old Store, about 30 or 40 miles from here. There was an important battle that happened 18 days before Cowpens. And again, that is the Battle of Hammond's Old Store, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later on, because many of the lessons, the teamwork that was developed at Hammond's Old Store came into play here to the nth degree. So again, this is an occurrence that happened at the end of the fight. We do know that Tarleton got away, and William Washington also lived to fight another day. So we'll talk about now how the battle progressed. What was the layout of the battlefield here, and the layout here and the terrain here are 2 very important features. 3 miles down the road is where Sergeant Everhart got captured. Daniel Morgan set out skirmishers throughout here to slow down the British advance. He had Joseph McDowell and the North Carolina militia sharpshooters on his right flank, 75 men or so. And he had Samuel Hammond and the South Carolina sharpshooters and Georgia sharpshooters under John Cunningham here on the left flank. And these skirmishers were set up in groups of 3. And as they saw the British coming down, and they would have been coming down in column formation, the instructions to the skirmishers were to aim from the epaulettes, shoot the officers first. And so as the skirmishers started plucking away at that marching column, and of those groups of three, you'd have one man shooting at a time, and then another one, and then the third, and by the time the third shot, the first one would be loaded again. The point was to never have unloaded muskets in your, or rifles in your group. And that was a philosophy that does play out throughout this entire battle. Always have at least one guy with a loaded shot. And those rifles took 60 seconds to load. They were incredibly slow. The weaponry here was very primitive. The most effective weapons here were bayonets and swords. Forget cannons and muskets and rifles. It came down to the sword. But Tarleton was forced to transition into column to line formation from the column, and he starts coming on through. And again, the skirmishers are just popping away, pop, 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 and the Tarleton's force is getting debilitated. Tarleton had been chasing Morgan for miles and miles, from Grindle Shoals all the way up to here. And one of the factors about this battle is the fact that the Broad River is 6 miles down through there. That's the biggest river in the western South Carolina. You don't just walk across the Broad River. That is a difficult crossing, and there's only particular places where you could do so at the forts. So Tarleton's getting a little bit excited because he's thinking, well, Morgan's got to cross that river. He's going to have the river at his back. I've got a big advantage. We're going to pin him against the river.
Hammer and anvil.
Right. So, you know, that was a factor. But again, 6 miles away. You got plenty of room to skedaddle if you need to and not have to go across that river. And see, that was part of Morgan's plan as well. So, these British troops are coming through the same area that Morgan had gone, because he was retreating. It was a, planned retreat. And as he was retreating, he was foraging all the goods, all the food that was in that entire area. That's how his army was supporting itself. And then as Tarleton comes up behind him through the same territory, there's nothing for him to get. These British soldiers did not eat for 48 hours before this battle. For 2 days they had nothing to eat. And they had been up since the last 36 hours, chasing after Morgan. So, they were wore out by the time they got here. Plus, they marched 12 miles, right before dawn when this battle started. And this battle definitely started right at dawn. So, Tarleton deploys in line formation. They march through and they overwhelm the skirmishers. And as planned, the skirmishers retreat. And what they do is they retreat to the militia line, which is located back through there. Now, you see the broom sedge? You see where the broom sedge ends? What's on the other side of that? You see this pine tree right there, in the center of the opening, so to speak. Now, pay attention to that pine tree. Do those limbs look like they're at ground level? They look like they're at ground level, but they're not. They're 10 feet above ground level. So that is a crest, that is the crest of this, little plateau. But 10 feet beyond that crest is what is referred to as the military crest. And if you were defending that spot, you wouldn't be standing up on the top of that crest. You would be standing on the reverse slope. And on the reverse slope was where Andrew Pickens set up his militia. 4 regiments of the South Carolina militia. On the far right is Thomas Brandon, the 2nd Spartan Regiment, also known as the Fair Force Regiment. Next to him is Joseph Hayes and the Little River Regiment. Little River is present-day Lawrence County. Then, just to the left of that road there is John Thomas Jr. and the 1st Spartan Regiment. And on the far left is Benjamin Roebuck and Roebuck's Battalion of the Spartan Regiment. 3 Spartanburg regiments right there, and the Lawrence County Little River Regiment. As Tarleton comes up, he's approaching from down there. Now, do you see that depression there? So he's down there, okay? What does he see? He sees nothing. So, as his men come up through here, and again, he's deployed in line formation. On his flank, he's got the 17th Light Dragoons. That's where Cornet Patterson came from. The 17th Light Dragoons is the best cavalry unit that the British Army has. These are British regulars. Now I'm going to be talking about the British Legion and the British Legion cavalry, but those are American provincials from up north, New York, New Jersey, those areas, who are now part of Tarleton's cavalry, but as Americans fighting for the Loyalists, the provincials. So, 17th Light Dragoons. Next in line is the light infantry. Now, when we use the word light in Revolutionary War times, that does not mean lightweight. That means they are the tough guys. They travel light. They travel fast. Give them a knapsack on their back, and they are good to go. They can cover 25 miles in a day, just day after day. So they're the tough guys. And these hand-picked men from the 71st and the 16th regiments, 150 of them are now as infantrymen, second in line. Next to them is the British Legion infantry. And these are Tarleton's men. These are, again, provincials, Americans, fighting for the British forces. The light infantry was in red. The British Legion infantry is in green. Next comes the 7th Regiment of Foot, which is a very storied regiment with a 300-year history, except that this regiment is got a lot of new people in it because they've had people, age out and that sort of thing, lost people in battle. And they do have some raw recruits in that regiment. This was not the finest hour of the 7th Regiment of Foot. Also, many members of the 7th Regiment of Foot and the British Legion were Patriots captured at Camden. If you were a Continental soldier and you got captured at Camden, you had 2 options. You could go to Charleston and spend the rest of the war on a prison ship, which was the worst existence imaginable. Or you could join the British Army. Now that wasn't much better, but they had a number of comrades of the 1st and 2nd Maryland and the Delawareans that were now fighting for the British. These are referred to as halfway men. And you can imagine they're not the best soldiers. And there's cases here where they ran into their friends and, what are we doing shooting at each other? There was a Native American here named Thomas Tyak who was captured at Camden. And now he's with the British, and he, throws down his gun, and he was accepted immediately back into the Maryland ranks. So, that's the line here was the light infantry, the British Legion infantry, the 7th Regiment of Foot. In reserve is the best regiment that the British have in America, which is the 71st Regiment of Foot. The 1st Battalion, there's 2 battalions, only the 1st Battalion was here, but the 71st Regiment of Foot, who was a very successful regiment all the way through the South. They didn't lose anything. They were at Blackstocks, which was another Tarleton defeat, but the 71st was the best of the best. And they were in reserve, 200 or 300 men in reserve. Also in reserve was Tarleton's British Legion cavalry. 3 companies of them, plus a 4th company under David Ogilvy, who will come into play a little bit later on. So, when Tarleton approaches and the skirmishers are driven in under orders, probably from Andrew Pickens, possibly from Daniel Morgan. Now, Daniel Morgan was all over this battlefield during the battle, and he was given very specific and particular orders. And he would give those orders to Pickens, and Pickens would relay them, or he would give them directly. Same thing with John Eager Howard in the Continental line. Morgan was all over the battlefield. So as the skirmishers are drawing in, well, now they've got, a solid line of militia right there. What are these 150 skirmishers supposed to do? What they did was Joseph Hayes and the Little River Regiment took 50 paces forward. And you see the high ground right there. That's where, there's no more than like 10 or 15 feet elevation difference on this whole battlefield. But that's where Joseph Hayes and the Little River Regiment moved forward to. And that spot right there is referred to as Hayes Rise. Hayes Rise of Little River Regiment, Lawrence County, South Carolina. And he's right there fighting with his buddies from Spartanburg and Fair Forest area. What happened here at this battle? These 3 minutes in this line is the most glorious 3 minutes in South Carolina Revolutionary War history for the South Carolina militia. The South Carolina militia was absolute heroes here at this battle, and they proved it right there. So, Tarleton is coming up, and he knows that he was harassed by skirmishers, but what's the big deal? Excuse me. He doesn't know what he's got. Is this a delaying action, somebody just trying to hold him back so Morgan can get his army across the Broad River? What's going on? Surely he's not going to stand and fight me. And Tarleton's coming right down this road, and he's looking up, and he's standing up in his stirrups, and he's looking, and he sees Hayes' men right there. 60 guys. What's that? He's got the 1,000, on his flanks, coming on. They're marching on. So, as he gets up here, Joseph Hayes pulls back into position. And Samuel Hammond, who was over here as sharpshooters with the South Carolina and Georgia sharpshooters, they come in on the left flank of the Patriot line. And Joseph McDowell and his North Carolina sharpshooters, they came through and they get on the right flank of the Patriot forces. So, at this time, I'm going to...
Yes.
You see the crest? Are we 50 yards from the crest? I don't know. Where's 50 yards from that crest? It's somewhere around in here. And it's not that far from the crest. So, as Tarleton sees, he gets to about the point of where we were, and then he realizes that there is a line of militiamen all the way down through here. Now again, They were on the military crest, which is below the actual crest. And many of these militiamen, you could only see them from the waist up, if you could see them then. And it's so foggy and misty, and you know, this is pretty good weather for what happened then. So he has his men coming at the double quick. These men who hadn't eaten in 48 hours or slept in 36 hours and just marched 12 miles, now he's got them running, you know, with their rifles. Now, when they did see this militia line, they stopped and they dressed themselves or undressed themselves. They got rid of anything they didn't need, and then they started coming through again. And Daniel Morgan is behind this militia line, and he's yelling, "Hold your fire, hold your fire." And he gave this order, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." And that's 50 yards. It's about this far, right? So as Tarleton's deploying his men, 17th Light Dragoons over there, light infantry, British Legion infantry, 7th Regiment of Foot, with the 71st Regiment in reserve. Except that the 7th Regiment and the 71st Regiment, they get tangled up and delayed. And it's more open on this side, and the light infantry is advancing. And they're kind of ahead of the British Legion, which is right here, and then the 7th Regiment is further back. And as these light infantry get up to about right here, 50 yards, all of a sudden the 2nd Spartan Regiment lets loose with a murderous volley. And when that volley occurred, there was a line of dead redcoats laying on the ground right through there. And then John Thomas Jr. and the 1st Spartan Regiment, they let out a volley. And then Joseph Hayes let out a volley. And then Benjamin Roebuck, his regiment, they let out a volley. At every volley, there were lines of dead redcoats laying on the ground. The burial party, when they came here, they said it's a most singular event. So by the time those 4 volleys were fired and the attacking British forces were shocked, you know, they were stunned. They stopped and they slowly gathered their wits. And the British Legion was able to advance again. And as they advanced, the 2nd Spartan Regiment under Thomas Brandon, they had time to reload. So they fired a 5th volley. And that stopped the attack of the British Legion infantry. But now you've got these hundreds of men charging forth with bayonets, and these guys have unloaded rifles. What you gonna do? And what they did was what they were ordered to do. Now, you know, many accounts said, well, Daniel Morgan told them to fire 3 times and call it a day and they would have won, or fire twice. No, they didn't. He fired once. And then the British were right on them, and now it's a foot race. They're chasing after you with bayonets on their muskets. Those bayonets were the most feared weapon on the battlefield. These men were fighting with spears. That's how primitive it was. Spears that could shoot once, like one and done. Then you have to stop, wait 20 seconds, and do all your loading. You're out of the fight during that time. So the militia files off to the right or through the Continental lines. They set things up so you could do that. And Tarleton sees this from the back there, and he sees the militia running. It's Camden all over again. And he orders his 17th Light Dragoons to charge. Now this is the best that the British have. They came to America in 1776, 300 strong. By the time they're here at Cowpens, there's 50 of them. They, transfer out and that sort of thing. But they're British regulars who live for this cavalry charge, and they charge through, and they start attacking the militia with unloaded rifles. And it was the Little River Regiment that got the worst of that. Well, our hero, William Washington, sees this. Now, what we have set up here is referred to as defense in depth. The strategy of this battle here is still taught to this very day at West Point. It was brilliant in how Daniel Morgan set things up. He set up lines of defense, successively stronger each one. The whole idea was to wear Tarleton down before they got to that final main line of resistance, which was the Continentals. So, the lines of defense were the skirmishers, the militia line, the Continentals, but then the fourth was the cavalry. And William Washington and 80 members of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, they had come down a couple of days after Christmas. They saw where some plundering Tories had been ravaging through the Fair Forest district. They gathered together 200 mounted riflemen under the command of James McCall. Now, this is a local militiaman, James McCall, Colonel James McCall. And they put him in charge of these 200 mounted militiamen, which consist of Samuel Hammond and his state troops, Thomas Brandon and the 2nd Spartan Regiment, and Joseph Hayes and the Little River Regiment. These three regiments right here had just fought together 18 days previously at Hammond's old store, 30-40 miles from here, under the command of James McCall. And William Washington and James McCall worked so well together in that battle. And in that battle, they attacked 250 plundering Tories. And 150 of them were killed and wounded. 40 of them were captured. 60 of them escaped to fight the next day, and they lost 8 more men there. These groups had absolutely wiped out the loyalist militia opposition at Hammond's old store. And as a result of that, Morgan was here to spirit up the people. 1,000 militiamen came into his camp. He started out with 1,000 Continentals. Now his size is doubled. And he used those militiamen to extremely good effect here on the militia line. So that was valuable experience. And when William Washington was here, set up as a cavalry commander, in the 4th line of defense, he had an extra supply of 40 swords. And what he did was he gave these to James McCall and 40 of his hand-picked men. So now there is an auxiliary cavalry force here. And James McCall and his men had never fought as cavalrymen before. But these guys were smart, athletic guys. They knew what to do, and now they're here working in conjunction with William Washington. So William Washington sets up 2 groups of cavalry. He's got his 3rd Continental, and then he's got James McCall and Benjamin Jolly's, their group, together on each side of the road. When William Washington sees the 17th Continental Light Dragoons start charging into the retreating militia and causing wounds. This is where the Little River Regiment got its most wounds, was right here. William Washington charges forth with his dragoons, and he catches the 7th at an oblique angle, and he goes through and he's just chopping those guys to pieces. Thomas Brandon, colonel of the 2nd Spartan Regiment, he's got a sword, he's an officer, he's mounted, he gets in hand-to-hand combat with these veterans of the 17th Light Dragoon, and he kills 3 of them himself. He was one hell of a fighting man. You didn't mess with Thomas Brandon. And of the 50 dragoons that went into that battle, 18 were left dead on the field. And the 17th Light Dragoons was not an effective force after that. So, we can probably talk about this here as well as anywhere else, because while Tarleton was attacking the left flank, he was also eyeing what was going on in the right flank. And remember, the 7th Regiment wasn't heavily involved. The 71st Regiment, the veterans, they weren't involved at all. And he's also got Ogilvy's company of the British Legion on his left flank, about 50 men, and he sends those men through on the right flank. And Ogilvy and his company, now they're constrained by the River Cane bottomlands, but they get through, and so they get through and they come all the way around to the back side of the Continental Line.
I think she
So-
usually doesn't see you all here.
So, now Washington and his group is over here dealing with 17th Light Dragoons. James McCall is in reserve, and James McCall sees Ogilvy's company, who is the best of the British Legion. He sees them coming around to the back side of the Continentals. That's when James McCall and his men charge with their brand new swords, and they go through and they just cut the British Legion under Ogilvy. They just cut them to pieces. And then after they did that, they did what only the most experienced cavalry units do. They turned around and came back through, cutting and hacking as they went. So Ogilvy's company, they were out of commission as well. Tarleton still got 3 companies of the British Legion back there in reserve. But he's sending these people forward. Now they've regrouped. The militia line has retreated, and he can come forward. And he's coming forward with his troops at the double quick after they've been mile after mile after mile walking and marching with nothing to eat. At this point, we're going to go down to the Continental. You know, they would have had salt pork and biscuits. You know, they had flour and cornmeal. They had live cattle. You know, they would have, armies moved with herds as best they could. Y'all remember that pine tree?
Oh yeah.
See how high the bottom limbs are off the ground? So, you know, you can kind of see the crest here. That's Hayes Rise. This rifleman here would have been kneeling down because he's more exposed than the rest of these guys. But they could stand back here, you know, and just pop away and be halfway protected. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll head on down a little bit now. So this is where the Continental Line was lined up. Samuel Hammond, as he retreated, he came through, and there was a gap between the end of this line and the swamp down there. So he plugged that gap. Next to him was some North Carolina militiamen who had just come in about an hour or two before the fight, and they were placed in that position. there wasn't a lot of activity right then, because now the center of the action has shifted over to this side. But along here, next in line, would have been the triplets Virginians, who were militiamen, but they had served for 3 years. They had served their terms of enlistment in the Continental Army, fighting in the North with George Washington. Very experienced fighters. And now they're together here as militiamen at Cowpens under Triplet. Next you have, in the center of the battle, Kirkwood's Delawareans. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the state of Delaware for those fellas. And then next, Babbitt's, who I've been relating Lawrence Babbitt's recounting of this battle. He refers to the Maryland companies. Now, 1st and 2nd Maryland Regiment, 5th Maryland Regiment, they've been so decimated by the losses at Camden, he's referring to them as companies. So you've got the 1st and 2nd Maryland Company and the 5th. The 1st Maryland Regiment is Washington's Immortals. They are the best in the Patriot Continental line. They held off the Battle of Long Island, held off thousands of British troops so that a retreat could be made. Out of 400 men, they lost 250. Some of the bravest soldiers in America were right here with the 1st and 2nd Maryland Regiments. And then on the other side, beyond them, were the Virginia Continentals under Andrew Wallace. And that was as far as the Continental line extended on the right. There had been action on the Continental left, but now the 71st Regiment of Foot is coming into play. And they start coming through here, and as they come through, when they come over the crest of that hill, this whole Continental line is hidden. And now all of a sudden they come through and they see that there's another whole fresh army right there, right in front of us. So they stop, and they did start trading volleys back and forth. And the Delawareans suffered their greatest casualties during this time. But finally, the 71st and the officers, the 7th Regiment, remember that their officers had been killed. And they start coming on. They fire a volley and they start charging forth like a mob, not coordinated. But there is pressure put on the right flank. And Morgan and everybody else is worried about what's going to happen on the right flank, because there could very well be a breakthrough over there. So the order is given to refuse the right flank. And when you do that, you just pivot, and now you can't be inflated. You've got defense against somebody coming in from the side. But that order was misunderstood, or wasn't given properly, who knows. Andrew Wallace, who was the commander of the Virginia Continentals who gave the order, he did not survive the battle. So we don't know exactly what the details were there. So as the Virginians start to refuse the right flank, then the Maryland and the Delawareans, they're like, oh, those guys are stepping back. I guess we're retreating. So they start retreating. And this whole line now starts to retreat. And this is a critical moment of the battle because, you know, Tarleton had been weakened and weakened and weakened, but still, here he's got his best men attacking over here on the right. And so Daniel Morgan's really worried. He comes up to John Eager Howard, who was the commander of this Continental line, and he says, "Are you defeated, sir?" And Colonel Howard says, "Do those men look defeated to you?" And he said, "Well, no, they don't. Have them meet me on this spot, on that hill, where I'm going to ride." So, you see where those magnolia trees are? Mm-hmm. That's the point where Daniel Morgan stood as this entire line is falling back. But they're retreating under orders, and they are loading as they retreat. And so now they're marching back with loaded weapons, with bayonets on them. And they get to the spot where Morgan is right there, and he says, "Turn and fire." Now, by the time they did this, these British regulars are just charging full speed ahead, and they're no further than I am from you. This is how close they were. They turned and they fired a tremendous volley right there, a murderous volley. And the 71st Regiment of Foot, the best the British had to offer, they were decimated. They were laying down on the ground. And now the Patriots are charging, and they've got the bayonets, and they are bayoneting. And the 71st surrenders. On top of this, Andrew Pickens and his militiamen who had come through, they had survived the attack of the 17th Light Dragoons. They had gotten all the way back to where their horses were. And this was part of Morgan's plan. He left the militiamen and out. If they wanted to run away from this battle, well, there's your horses, jump on your horse and you fly away. They had that option. But when they got back to the horses, they kind of realized things aren't so bad. And Andrew Pickens and General Morgan rallied them. And Pickens leads this men all the way around to this side of the battlefield. William Washington is over here on this side of the battlefield. Now, the 71st Regiment of Foot is totally enveloped. It's a double envelopment, one of 3 cases in history that led to a double envelopment. And the officers of the regular army, they just surrender forthwith. They go to Andrew Pickens and hand them their swords. He collected 7 swords that day. One of the officers went up to John Edgar Howard and he says, "Will you accept my sword?" He says, "Yeah, I accept it. You're a prisoner. Now go to the rear." Well, the guy just stood there and he said, "Go to the rear." He stood there. He's holding on to his stirrups and everything. He said, "What's the man? What's your problem?" He said, "We were ordered to give no quarter, and we expect the same." And Howard's like, "Well, we don't operate that way. You get your ass to the back." And you know, they wanted to surrender to Andrew Pickens because they knew he was a man of honor. Andrew Pickens was a Christian warrior. And those names sound contradictory to a degree, but Andrew Pickens' enemies knew that he was a fair man, he was an honest man, and he would treat them according to the rules of humanity. And that's what he did. So that's what led to the wholesale surrender. 500 captives here, 200 casualties, killed and wounded. That's what happened here at the Cowpens, and that's why this was such an outstanding victory. Tarleton ordered his remaining Legion cavalry to come back into the fray and try to break the attack of the Patriots there. And his British Legion back there, 3 companies of them, they refused to charge. They refused his orders. And primarily because they saw what he had done 6 weeks ago with the Battle of Blackstocks when he ordered a charge right into the thick of the Patriot defenses. And out of 270 men, he had 92 killed and 110 wounded. And he declared that a victory for himself, but he lost pretty significantly. So that's pretty much, you know, things as they evolved in this very momentous battle. Does anybody have any questions?